broadcasting from Tower Studio. With your anchors, Katie McCoy and Ellie Pomerleau, bringing you the latest in Blue Gold News. This is Blue Gold News Now.
Good evening, I'm Ellie Pomerleau.
And I'm Katie McCoy.
On tonight's episode of BNN, we are breaking down the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Joining us here is Professor of Political Science and International Relations, Damir Kovacevic.
Thank you for joining us tonight. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing well, thanks.
Doing well.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background in international relations?
Sure. So I'm a political science professor. I teach international relations, comparative politics. My primary focus in international relations would be international security, political violence, ethnic conflict, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Very relevant to what's obviously happening.
Yeah, we are definitely excited to hear with your expertise about what's going on in Ukraine right now. So to break it down for students, what is the main conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
So the main conflict is mostly Putin-driven right now. What's happening is Putin invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country, and the Ukrainians are fighting for their sovereignty. They're fighting for their essentially right to exist, and Putin has made it a point to sort of suggest that Ukraine and Russia are inseparable. So he doesn't see a difference between Ukraine and Russia. He doesn't see Ukraine as an independent entity. He thinks that Ukraine, much like the rest of the Soviet republics, were creations of the former Soviet Union under Lenin, and then it was upheld by Stalin and Khrushchev. And so he never really thought that Ukraine ever existed as its own thing. And how he just wants it back. And so he did it in 2014 when he took Crimea. He's had the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, and now it looks like he wants most of Ukraine. So the conflict it's simple. It's Putin illegally invading and Ukraine fighting to hold what's rightfully theirs.
Why did Putin decide that armed conflict had to take place?
Good question. So none of us are too surprised that Putin wanted conflict. What we're surprised about is how quickly it's escalated and to what degree. So Putin was sort of preparing the troops on the Belarusian border and the Ukrainian-Russian border, and he was just kind of waiting until the Olympics were done, right? He didn't want to mess with China. He didn't want to kind of steal their spotlight. So it was always fairly clear that he was going to do this. What was less clear, and which is what's sort of puzzling now and kind of frightening, is that Putin is going as far as he did. So he seems unhinged. He seems sort of devoid from the truth. He seems more radical. He's making demands that just don't seem very rational, like we know in the past. And so he's invading in a lot of ways because, again, like I said earlier, he doesn't see Ukraine as an independent, sovereign entity. And he's also mad that NATO has kind of creeped into the territory, and all this talk about Ukraine potentially becoming a NATO member, he doesn't like that either.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, especially, with Putin being, as you say, irrational. What has been the West's response to Russia's actions and how Putin's been acting?
So sanctions, right? Sanctions, more sanctions, kind of incremental sanctions is what we've seen from the West. So it started out with rounds of sanctions last week from President Biden and European allies. Newer sanctions just today. We've banned Russian flights from our airspace. We've hit Russian institutions, Russian banks, oligarchs, which is another term for elites, Putin himself a little bit. So our response has been forceful, coordinated, multilateral sanctions, which is good. Sanctions don't always have the effect that we want them to have, but when it's a kind of a team effort, it's better. So we've done that, and we've provided military aid to Ukraine, but we've not actually joined the conflict in a direct way. And we've been very clear about actually staying out of the conflict in that kind of way.
Yeah, so you mentioned these sanctions, and you said that they have been kind of effective. Do you think they are as effective as they could be? Do you think we should continue applying more, or do we have to take a more drastic measure?
So sanctions generally only have a 5 to 30% success rate, which isn't great. When done on their own, if one country were to apply sanctions, they often don't have the kind of sway that we want them to have. We're looking for policy or political change, right? We want Russia to stop doing what it's doing. But when the entire world backs it in a way, and everyone is on the same message as we're seeing the pressure kind of on the Russian people. We're seeing the pressure on the Russian government. We're seeing the pressure on the Russian economy, which right now is just in a financial crisis. So they are having a devastating effect and unfortunately some of that hits everyday Russian people. They're not having the kind of policy changes we'd want them to have, which is we want Putin to stop, right? He's not going to stop anytime soon. But they are kind of that middle ground between diplomacy, which is off the table, and war, which is also off the table.
What actions have we seen What actions have we seen Ukraine taken to protect their sovereignty?
Well, Ukraine's been pretty brave and courageous. Anybody that's the age, I think 18 to 60, all men have been asked to stay and fight in Ukraine. And so we've seen a lot of just volunteer fighters. We've seen their military, of course. They've held their own fairly well. I think a lot of people are surprised by that Russia hasn't overtaken Ukraine in the amount of time that we expected them to. They kind of have the whole world behind them, but unfortunately what that is, it's mostly just messages. Yes, it is aid, it is weapons sales to them, but largely it has been a Ukrainian effort. And so that's what they've been doing. They've been protecting their territorial sovereignty against an illegal invasion.
So kind of what you meant with that is that Ukraine civilians are faced with great security risk as a result of this conflict. And although the UN has started to take notice of this, there hasn't been intervention yet. Do you think that's the next step?
No, and that's because any sort of international relations student can tell you there's something called the United Nations Security Council, and you guessed it, Russia is on the United Nations Security Council. So because Russia is on the United Nations Security Council, it has a veto power. And it can essentially veto any kind of authorizations and any kind of decisions that are made. Most recently, just yesterday, there was a vote to condemn the action in Ukraine. All but 4 countries condemned Russia. Russia, of course, didn't condemn itself. So it's very difficult to authorize interventions when you have a state that can essentially block. It seems like a conflict of interest, but Russia has the right to do that. And so I don't see any forceful humanitarian intervention, and a lot of that is because of the structural weakness of the United Nations.
As a result of this conflict, international relationships have definitely shifted. How will this impact future relationships between countries?
Well, I think weirdly it's made the West, it's kind of brought the West together in a way. It's brought Western countries in a firmer NATO alliance. So that's a positive. Like we've recommitted to NATO, and that's a good thing. It has kind of divided the world between sort of this like good and evil, and there's a lot more on the good. What's unclear to me right now is what this says after the fact, right? Does this mean that we have a Western NATO alliance against the Russian state, which would be weaker, in my opinion, or does this kind of bring a Russia-China alliance against more of a Western alliance? Because right now China's been kind of just sort of staying out of the conflict and being very vague about what they're saying. So that's kind of what we're watching. I wouldn't be surprised to see some kind of what we call power shifts in the international system. If Russia is successful with Ukraine, they could potentially try for more territory, although I think that would be ill-advised because I don't think Russia has the capability to do that because they would face the NATO alliance at that point. So we are seeing some shifting in alliances and what we call polarity, so it's interesting to see.
Yeah, for sure. I think you bring up a great point about how this has been an ongoing conflict. It just hasn't really hit that point of being at the level it is right now. As a professor of political science, did you see this conflict coming and reaching this drastic of a point?
So this specific one with Ukraine and Russia?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Unfortunately, yes, because Putin has been so clear about it. You have to look to recent history. So if you look at recent history, 2008, Putin invades the country of Georgia. 2014, it's Crimea, very successfully. And then he's made demands about eastern Ukraine and Ukraine in general. He's been kind of gearing up for this. We know it's been coming. The mobilization of troops is very evident. So that to me signaled that he's going to do something that is going to be intense. What we didn't probably expect was that he wanted all of Ukraine, that he was going to go in with this kind of mentality, and he's coming off as kind of a crazy man. The other thing that I would point to, and if you're kind of looking at the research, Russia and Ukraine have historical grievances. That's not a good recipe for peace. They have territorial issues. That goes against peace. They have a ongoing rivalry. So if you put that together, plus a kind of more unhinged Putin, it's going to be a recipe for conflict.
So this conflict obviously has a lot of different factors, and it can be a little bit confusing. But why do you think it's important for students to understand what is going on?
I think it's important because even if you don't want to talk about it, you don't want to hear about it, it's happening, right? Like, it's happening and it's important. And I would tell students from just a human perspective that the human toll is going to be devastating, and it has already. We have 1 million refugees and asylum seekers and displaced people who will need to go somewhere else. Some of those people will come to the United States on temporary protection status. Some of those people will go throughout Europe. So that in itself is devastating. And so although we can't all wrap our heads around conflict and war, and many of us will never see a battlefield, what we can, I think, comprehend is imagining, putting yourself in the shoes of somebody who's lost everything, and because of this very unnecessary conflict, very unnecessary war. So if anything, look at the human toll and what's happening there, and you're just more informed. I think just being informed about it is always a good thing. Ignorance is never the way to go. So.
Well, Damir, you've done a great job of breaking this conflict down. I think it's definitely going to help students understand better what's going on. I've learned a lot from this conversation. I guess, is there anything that you would like to add or specifically comment on?
I would just say, it's unfortunate that it's happening. It saddens me, it kind of angers me. It's a totally avoidable conflict. What I want to, I guess, stress is we talk about conflict and war, and I teach a class called International Conflict, but war is actually very rare. Like, wars don't happen that often. And when they do happen, and they're so unjustified as the one that you're watching, it's just so unfortunate that we have to watch it sort of unravel. So for me, what I would wish is that this comes to an end sooner than later. But I would also add that I think we've seen a pretty good response from our student body and people at Eau Claire who have been paying attention and talking about this, and just from everybody around the world who's sort of been in support of Ukraine. So those positive messages are always nice to see. So.
That's definitely a great point.
Yeah.
Yes.
For sure.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I personally learned a lot, as Ellie just said, and I think you really did a great job at breaking it down for students.
Yes, hopefully next time that we have you on, it's not discussing a global conflict. I hope we can discuss something a little bit less depressing next time you're on, but you brought so much expertise, and we're really thankful that you could join us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Coming up after the break, UWEC's Campus Closet is working to expand their hours and resources for students.
And a UW Eau Claire Performance collaborates with a Pablo Center exhibit.
Stay with us.
Welcome back, and thanks for staying with us.
President Joe Biden gave his State of the Union address on Tuesday night. In the 1 hour and 3 minutes Biden spoke at the podium, he addressed several important topics, including Ukraine, the coronavirus pandemic, and inflation. In the beginning of the speech, he stated that Russia would pay a price for invading Ukraine, and also said that he would ban Russian planes from entering American airspace. When talking about inflation, Biden told companies to lower their costs, not their wages. When mentioning the coronavirus, Biden urged Americans to get vaccinated and also pushed for faster production of an antiviral pill for vulnerable citizens. And in a step away from the Democratic Party, he called for more funding of the police, saying, quote, "Fund them with the resources and training they need to protect our communities."
If you're a fan of Russian vodka, you may not want to shop local. Eau Claire's local grocery store, Woodman's, will no longer carry brands from Russia. This information was shared in a post by Woodman's Food Market that stated none of their locations will be carrying Russian vodka. The post ended with a hashtag that says, #WeStandWithUkraine. Woodman's is not the only grocery store to pull Russian liquor off the shelves in response to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. America is putting sanctions on Russia, and some local businesses are taking a stand by doing so as well.
With the career fair being just around the corner, students can now make full use of a special student support program called the Campus Closet. Located in the lower level of Brewers Hall, room 49, the Campus Closet opened in 2018 to help UWEC students with the expense of buying a new professional wardrobe. Students can now get access to gently used business attire for presentations, internships, job interviews, and even career fairs, all free of charge. The main goal of the closet is to make sure that UWEC students aren't stressing out about what suit they are going to wear for an internship and letting that get in the way of their success. The closet also includes dressing rooms and rooms for steaming and ironing clothes. Campus Closet intern Lizzie Fleck says that this resource would not have been possible without all of the generous donations from the staff, professors, and the local community members. The student intern also says that her team has been working very hard to serve the student body by having more hours available for them to come in and have easier access to the clothes.
I feel like there's a stigma that, like, especially since we're like with the pantry too, it's like one room. It's like it's for like lower income students, but it really is for all UW Eau Claire students. We want to serve as many students as possible. So we would like to break that stigma and have students use it because business clothes are pretty expensive. And as you can see, we have a lot here. So we would like to, have them use, and, people can take them too and keep them. They don't have to bring them back. So, yeah.
The campus closet is now open Monday through Thursday from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. in the lower level of Brewer Hall, room 49.
The UW Eau Claire's theater department is really embracing the power of and in their winter show, Silent Sky by Lauren Gunderson. In order to put on this show, they collaborated with the UWEC Science Department to make the show scientifically accurate. Actor Emily Szymanski and dramateg Lily Mader shared a little more about the show.
So Silent Sky is about Henrietta Leavitt and her journey in her astronomy career. So she was an astronomer in the early 1900s, and she was actually the one who discovered how to measure the distance between stars, which then other astronomers used to learn that the Milky Way is not the only part of the universe.
I met with Dr. Nathan Miller. He is a part of the astronomy department. We discussed Henrietta's theories and kind of breaking them down into an easier way for us actors and for the audience members to understand what is going on. So how the distance between stars, like why it really matters or why it might have been difficult to figure out. How to pronounce certain words in our show because we have a lot of astronomy words, so Cepheid and Magellanic Cloud and Nebulae and Novae, things like that. And he really helped explain why these women did what they did, which was really cool to see.
The show runs from March 4th through March 13th at the Riverside Theater. You can get tickets online at the UW Eau Claire Service Center website. Some say cats always land on their feet, but one cat stood on his feet to start a home invasion.
Silverstow the cat found himself and his gang shut out of his home, so he stood up and opened the door with his paws to let himself and at least 7 other cats inside to play. Let's take a look.
And that's why this is
our favorite story of the week.
That just cracks me up. I'm a cat, and she's constantly climbing and jumping on things, but that cat had to be pretty tall to get that door open.
It is impressive the way that cat could just jump up that tall to hang off the door handle, but I think it is so cute letting them all inside.
Well, and I think it's so funny that he just had like a literal gang of cats behind him,
Yes.
and they all just followed him inside.
Yes.
Like, he's just a little fearless leader.
That just makes me want to get a cat even more.
Yes.
I really want a little black cat. I think it would be so cute.
My cat is black. Her name is Midnight.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, I love her. And she stayed very, very tiny. But I do want a cat of my own as well. Especially if he or she could open the door like this cat.
Yes.
That's impressive.
I just thought that video was pretty funny
Yes.
and very cute as well.
Definitely put a smile on my face, especially after all that Ukraine-Russia talk
Yes,
tonight.
I would agree.
Well, that's all we have for you tonight.
We'll see you back here next week with your latest local and university news.
Make sure to follow TV10 on Instagram and check out our Instagram for more information about our weekly shows. I'm Ellie Pomerlew.
And I'm Katie McCoy. Thank you and good night.